Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Silvia, and I'm here with Nina Simon.
Hey.
We are at the Indianapolis Museum of Art for the MuseumNext conference, and Nina just gave an amazing presentation that got everybody excited. And we thought they would chat a little bit with her and give the people that are live streaming, following us on Periscope, the opportunity to ask some questions. So
and I'm a periscoping virgin.
So we just introduced Nina to periscoping, so she's gonna turn this into an amazing tool to engage audiences in California soon. So if you guys want to ask any questions, we have 3 people at the moment here, so they can relate the questions to us. I have a few questions just to break the ice, and I thought I would start with something basic. Where does your love and interest for museums come from?
I actually would not. I think I have an acquired love and interest in museums, but that's not what's at the heart of it for me. I didn't grow up going to museums and loving them or anything like that. I really became interested in museums kind of as a design problem, that, there is this potential for museums to be community spaces, to be places of free choice learning and inspiration, and so often we miss the mark. And so
You felt the need to...
Yeah, and my background, my education's in engineering, and so I'm used to saying, oh, something is broken,
we need to fix it.
Well, and let's take it apart, and let's see what's inside of here, and which are the pieces we could change, and which are the pieces we can't, and I mean, I think that, despite that design problem focus, it is really true that for me, the love and the passion comes from this idea of free choice learning and the idea of museums as places of self-directed, empowered learning, as opposed to externalized education. And so books like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, this idea about education systems not helping fuel people's full learning, got me very interested in places like museums, libraries, art centers, where people are coming on their own terms for their own reasons.
Okay. And you talked about museums being a little broken.
Sure.
What is broken in museums, and how can we fix it?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we're all broken, so it's not like it's unique to museums, but I think what I really see with museums is the aspirational language we use, what we say we're here for. We often are not doing so well. And I think that if we really were going to be gathering places, for example, if we were really going to be places of inspiration, we might be organized very differently. So I actually am not sure whether it's that museums are broken or whether we're just lying about what we are here to do. Mm-hmm. But I think that I believe in a lot of the aspirational language about museums. So I think if we want to achieve those aspirations, then we do need to really look at and think about, are the projects and the approaches we're taking really taking us in that direction?
Okay, so today you talked here about the inclusive museum. Mm-hmm. How does the inclusive museum look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I really talked about was that inclusion is a political act, and that it's not necessarily just about saying, we welcome you and that we're this kind of place, but it really bears out in the actions that you do. So, when you talk about who's in your audience or your sphere of participants, who are you seeking to engage? Who are you actually engaging? Are you setting some targets for how you want that to shift, or who you want your organization to look like? And I actually think there are a lot of different skins to take on that. You could say, we're a place that is about inspiring youth, and so we really want to include young people. And that could mean not just young people coming in as audience, but also young people, how are you employing young people? How are you working with young people to set the direction of the content? And similarly, if you say, oh, hey, we live in a community that is, in the case of my community, 30% Latino, how are we including Latino people? And I think all of this presumes something we don't often say, which is the reality that most museums in this country are founded and kind of have built up cultural practices that are like white, middle, upper class practices. And so I think we have to clearly own, okay, there's a culture of that, and what are the cultures that we want to embrace, and what does that mean has to change about our culture to do that?
I got a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lachlan wants to know, what is the role of the curator in an inclusive museum?
I think the role of a curator is to be somebody who I would say is still a space maker, maybe has a different role in terms of whether they're a taste maker or not. I think traditionally curation was about having this authorial authority to say, here's what belongs here. And I think that all of the skills that great curators have, they're always out, they are culture seekers, right? They're looking for the artist, the story, the trend, the movement that's bubbling up. That's all great, skills and expertise to bring in. And then it's just a question about, okay, how do you not have sole authorial kind of dictatorial control as you do that? And so how can you think of yourself more as documenting and supporting and fueling a movement that is created by others, as opposed to kind of telling the story just by yourself. And let me just say that curators are so comfortable and so great at doing that in support of artists, and we just have to be broader in who we support in that way.
So they have to become facilitators, essentially.
Which I think great curators already are for artists. And so it's a question about how do you expand, instead of saying, you're either in the tent or out and I'm zipping it closed tight after, I get X number of artists for the show. How do I start to think a little differently about, that open field of the art experience that's happening?
I mean, one of the things you talk about as a fundamental step into fighting for change and fighting for inclusion is really like fighting from the inside.
Sure.
And obviously that means also, fighting a system that has been working in a certain way for so long and making enemies in the process. So how does it feel? Do you have any suggestions of people that, for people that are going through this process and sort of dealing with the pain of that?
Right. Obviously, it feels lousy. Although one thing, you just said fighting against something that has been working. And I think...
No, that has been, happening.
Oh, yeah.
Happening, not working.
Well, yeah, but I think that what that speaks to is kind of interesting, which is, a lot of institutions are struggling with challenges, financial challenges in terms of changing face of demographics in the community relative to who's here. So I think that any institution that wants to seriously address those challenges, they have to be pretty open in looking for solutions. And so I think it's, I was just talking with somebody in the lobby who's at an institution that's very financially motivated, and she was talking about, how do I push some of this political work forward? I'm like, find a funder or a donor who gives to you, has given to you, might give to you, but doesn't now, for whom this is really important, then get them to talk to the board. Speak, if money talks, talk money. If numbers talk numbers. If heartwarming stories talk those stories. So, I think it's about matching your political advocacy to the things that actually make movement in your organization. And, as I talked about before, arming yourself, right? Taking care of yourself. Finding other people who are compatriots in the work. A lot of larger organizations, it's a lot of different pockets. And it's just like any revolutionary movement. As long as those pockets are disparate, nothing's going to happen. But if that group, if those people, those individuals identify each other and become a group, a lot can happen. So I think finding your compatriots, setting some clear goals, and speaking the language that already moves your institution is huge.
Now, obviously, is there a question, Susie?
We have two questions.
Yeah.
One, and it's kind of along with the same lines as that you were talking about, but they said, as an activist director, how do you walk the walk in regards to wage disparity and privilege?
So I think the biggest way we walk the walk there is in our hiring practices. So I talked about this a little bit in the talk, or in the Q&A, but I strongly believe that it is lazy and lousy to require a master's degree for an entry-level job. And we have been able to greatly diversify our staff. And I don't just mean demographically, but I mean attitudinally, experience people bring in, by really being honest with ourselves about what kind of skills does a person need for this job, and how could we hire somebody with those skills? We actually have a pretty intense hiring process with a long application where people really have to show us they can do the job, and it takes a lot of time for people to do. We basically ignore resumes. We use them to learn a little more about you, but my perspective is, even though it takes the applicant some time to do work to show me they can do the job, anybody could take those 3 hours and show me they could do the job, regardless of what's on their resume, as opposed to me screening resumes and saying, sorry, you don't have XYZ degree or background, and therefore, clearly you can't do that job. And, I don't do this to be altruistic. I do it because I want the best person for the job, and what's on your resume is not necessarily the best indicator that you can do the job. So I think that figuring out a hiring practice that really prioritizes what's important to you, putting your money where your mouth is in terms of, if you care about certain kinds of diversity on your staff, figure out ways to hire for that kind of diversity. Treat it as important, on those lists of required qualifications as other things. If you can't do it legally, if you feel like, wow, we're in a majority Black city and most of our staff is white, yes, you can't say we're hiring Black people, but you can do strategic outreach to organizations and to people and say, hey, I'd really love for you to apply, or do you know anybody? I'm looking for somebody who really represents this community. It's fine to do that. So, find the ways. Don't throw up your hands and say, oh, nobody of X background applied. That's BS. You didn't recruit anybody of that background to be involved in the process, and you didn't create a process where those people could be successful.
All right, another question for you. It's sort of on the same lines. It's from #MuseumWorkersSpeak.
Yeah.
But it says, how can museum leaders be persuaded to see the fight for better museum working conditions as, quote, their fight, unquote, fight too?
I think, I guess, I don't know. I'm curious about that question because I work in a really small museum. Like, when I think about, better working conditions, I just don't know what that person is referring to, and I feel like where I work, we're happy and we take care of each other. So I'm not close to that issue, and so I don't feel like it's something I urgently speak to. Then again, there are a lot of issues that I'm not personally close to that I do urgently speak to. I will say that to me, the big crisis around people who work in museums is the extent to which we do not reflect the communities that we want to engage. So the more, I want to talk about and advocate for that. And that is more important to me than advocating for those people who are already in museums, many of whom are part of the thing that I fight against. So, I think if there are, if Museum Workers Speak folks or whomever are looking for advocates, are they advocating for working conditions for themselves? Are they advocating for a certain kind of experience that happens in museums? And then obviously I think it's about then reaching out and trying to recruit some of those leaders, saying, hey, a lot of people have been so psyched about the opportunities that you give to your staff, or like, wow, you're the only museum we know that gives paid internships. This must be really important to you. Do you want to be part of this? And, you can recruit people into your movement. And the best way to do that is by cheering for, complimenting, and engaging the people who you think are doing a great job at it.
We have another question from Periscope. What's the most important measurement of success that you pay attention to if there could only be one?
If there could only be one.
Good question, Mark.
So at our museum we use 5, but we have 2 we call gateway ones, where it's like if you don't hit those 2, you can't take the project forward, and those are relevance and sustainability, where relevance is about, is it connected to what our community cares about, and sustainability is about, can we support it financially in terms of staff-wise, is it going to happen 2 weeks after this other thing that everybody's exhausted from? So, but if I had to choose one of those, I would always choose relevance. And honestly, I would, if I was going to choose a number, attendance. People always in our field are like, oh, it's more than the numbers. Yes, it is more than the numbers. But if you sell shoes, you're more successful if you sell more shoes. And, if I'm trying to engage people in art and history, I'm more successful if I engage more people. I don't understand why we want to rocket science ourselves away from attendance as not the only measure. But if I could choose one, that's the one I want.
Do you count non-visitors as attendance, so people online?
Online, no, because we can talk more about online, but it's not a big part of our strategy. Okay. We do talk a lot, and we do count a lot around activities and engagement that happens off-site. And there's actually even a weird kind of discussion that happens as we're now embarking on, so our audience has hugely grown and we decided to expand, but we're not expanding behind our walls with more gallery space. We're expanding by creating this public plaza next to the museum that's a creative community space. And so there's been this basic question about like when you have a 24/7 outdoor space that's part of your facility. I mean, that's a thing. I don't know how you guys do it here at the IMA. I guess now you charge people to go into the grounds, so you know that a little bit.
Yeah, we know a little bit more. There's still a part of the museum that is free, which is our Art and Nature Park.
And you count people who go there?
People.
And do you just count them in your big number, or do they count kind of separate?
Well, it's the first year that we are experiencing that, so we'll have to make that decision at the end of the year if we put it all together or we keep them separate for some reasons or not.
I do think it's really fascinating. It's kind of nerdy, but like on the counting thing, you know, if somebody has a deep engagement online, like why would that be less credible than doing so on site? Or I always, whenever people say like, oh, you know, people are coming on Friday night, they're just coming because it's like a social time. I'm like, what about those ladies who like come and they're like chatting about their marriage the whole time they're walking through the museum? Like we're going to say they are like way more credible than these other people. So I think that there are some interesting biases kind of ingrained in what we count and how we count.
Mark just said we should have different levels of engagement now.
Right, yeah, exactly. And you know, we actually do. So we focus locally exclusively. It's because our ultimate impact we care about is building a stronger, more connected community in Santa Cruz County. If you come visit us, Mar, we'll be nice to you. We'll be happy you're there. We don't really care because you're not going to help us build a stronger and more connected community in our locality, right? And because we are very geography specific. So we actually do like in our audience research and stuff like that, we separate so participants who come in as what most people call visitors versus people who are deep engagers, which could be anything from a collaborator on an event, a member, a volunteer, an intern, somebody who's part of a program, like our team program that meets again and again. So we actually do see there are different levels of engagement, but we see it as it's not like some people are better than
So you mentioned data before, and I am a data person, so I love data.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know what data you collect at your institution and what does this data tell you about the changes that you have brought?
Okay. So there are two ways that we collect data, and we've just done this big year of data, which has been awesome because we used to collect no data, and let me just say, I really still believe in the ability to, especially if you have a small team, we're all at all our events. It's really easy to see what needs to change. You don't necessarily need data, to make a change. And we really use this phrase, measurement that moves. So we only want to measure things where we feel like we could actually change because of it. No data that's like, it would be nice to know data. So, because our two kind of areas of focus are on social bridging and individual empowerment, our measurement is primarily focused there. So for social bridging, if we're going to engage people across the diversity of our county, we need a way to measure whether our people coming in represent the diversity of our county. So we do demographic data. We do age, income, race, ethnicity. We no longer do gender nor education because those are two measurements we've decided won't move us right now. And actually, if we had to pick only one of those, we would pick ethnicity. We're doing great on age, we're doing great on income, and those are very strategically useful for us for a funding perspective, but ethnicity is the one where we have a laser beam focus right now. So that's at the front end. Then if you talk about bridging, the question we ask on our visitor survey is, did you have a meaningful sometimes we ask, did you have a conversation? Sometimes we ask, did you have a meaningful interaction with a stranger? So we feel like conversations among strangers is a demonstration of first degree social bridging. Did you talk to somebody who's different from you? And 75% of our visitors do while they're at the museum, which I actually feel like is pretty beautiful in terms of if you think about all the places you go, Target, the movies, a restaurant, where except for very transactional encounters, you're not talking to strangers. Social bridging is a huge part of building a stronger community where we respect each other. So, and then with collaborators, deeper down that bridging, we ask, do you plan to continue any dialogues, relationships, collaborations that were sparked here? So we're asking for a deeper level of bridging. Are you going to really build a relationship? Then on the empowerment side, we feel like the first step to empowerment is feeling, and I guess I say we feel like, but we worked with some social psychologists to kind of develop these pathways. So on the empowerment side, the first step is feeling welcomed and included. So we ask people that. We don't really ask people like, did you like it? You know, but we do ask questions about, did you feel like, you know, staff were welcoming to you, things like that. And then we ask the question, and this is a little leading, but we ask, you know, did you leave ignited with an idea for how to be more creative in your own life? So again, it's not about what did you learn, it's about did you feel empowered as a creative agent in this space? And again, you know, a huge percentage of people say yes. And for deeper collaborators, we have a secondary empowerment question, which is about, you know, were you able to advance your work further because of your involvement with the museum? That's all audience facing.
Yeah.
I'll also just very briefly say that internally, you know, I mentioned we have these 5 things: relevance, sustainability, bridging, participation, and ignition. Each of those 5, we have a very short amount of measurements. So every staff member does a little bit of self-assessment after every project, and the goal is it only takes 15 minutes to do. And we've picked indicators for each of those 5. They're not perfect. We picked the ones that were easiest to measure consistently across everything that we do, and like grokkable. And so we use that internally, and the premise, and again, we're just in the first year of this, is that if we see that there are things we want to change on the audience side, then maybe we'll be able to track back to things that we can control in our program planning side and tweak those to shift this. Yeah.
So hopefully in the next few years we'll be able to see some of these movements.
Hopefully.
Are there any questions, Mark?
I have 2 questions, but guys, can you repeat it? Because I didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't read it. Zlachma had one, and I think Mark had one about social media and delving deeper into engagement with social media. That was just a sense of that one, but I don't know what Zlachma asked.
I got asked about how mobile is impacting on the museum.
I'm sure it is. You know, I work in a small market and a city that is a pretty hip creative city with a lot of people who work in Silicon Valley, but we are so far from a Brooklyn or a San Francisco in terms of the amount of engagement with mobile. And so for us, social media is really primarily focused on community building. So myself and a bunch of our staff, you know, are engaged in that space and are, you know, actively tweeting, Instagram, stuff like that. But it's more about kind of just having a mission filter and amplifying, you know, check out this awesome community collaborator, you know, Yesenia is going to talk about her work with incarcerated artists this Friday, come on down. So there is kind of a, there are marketing-ish elements to it, but we do a lot more kind of just being in our community online as opposed to, I would say we're pretty haphazard in how we use our institutional voice online. But I think that has to do with A, being small, and B, being in a market where the number of people on Twitter, it's cool. I know most of the people, or I know many of the people in Santa Cruz who are on Twitter, but that's about knowing people in your community. It's not really like an institutional strategy.
Yeah.
Any digital in gallery? Do you use digital in gallery?
Not a ton, and part of that's because we're cheap, but also because we feel like one of the values that people say back to us that they love about the museum is how tactile it is, and we have done, and we're not, it's not like we're opposed to it for some reason. Frankly, even the kind of very basic development to get an iPad to a point that you could like lock it down for, you know, to do a certain thing in the gallery, it's often just way easier for us to make something with cardboard or something like that. And so there hasn't yet been a thing where we're like, oh my God, we gotta go digital to do X.
So we have one last question because we want to give her 10 minutes to breathe before the next session. So I'm curious to know if you can talk a little bit about the processes that you put in place in your institution to create the kind of experience, inclusive experience that you create. Like, is there a sort of a process that you have in place, or is it sort of more brainstorming, free flow, and whoever gets a good idea in, you just make it happen?
No, I mean, I think it was that way in the beginning when it was sort of wide open. And I think actually one of the things that's been quite hard as we've grown, because we've grown from 7 full-time staff to 14 and we've gotten more, like now we have more of a machine, is you just start to realize like, oh, these are how these are how machines slow down, is that you can't be as responsive. On the other hand, you can set a goal and you can chart, there's a lot more boots on the ground going in that direction. So I think the biggest thing that I've learned is to set a very clear goal that everybody understands, and then make as much space as possible for everybody to be part of it. And we really feel like, especially with some things, like we've been working on this big Latino inclusion focus, it was like, okay, here's our goal, that the people who come to the museum ethnically are representative of the diversity of our county. And we know exactly what those percentages are. We can set, it's a one-sentence goal. And then I have a colleague, Stacey Garcia, who, met with every single staff member and with the board to say, okay, for the next 6 months, what's collections target around this goal? What's memberships target around this goal? No judgment about what those are, help in figuring those out if needed, but everybody's part of it. And so, and sometimes that's a pretty top-down approach. There have been other times where it's like, here's the goal, kind of internalize this and work it into what you do. But I think especially with Latino inclusion, it's we know that we have to flex new muscles to do that. We knew we had to make some real changes to do it. So we wanted to make sure it was written down, that everybody is, and that we kind of have a point person who's checking in. So I think that's what I'm learning now that we're a little bigger is I think this may be a new approach for us. We have this whole new thing going on, this affirmation and invitation thing, and kind of having a point person where it's present the goal to everybody and then work together to identify lots of opportunities, but then have some point person who is keeping people a little bit accountable to make sure that it's continuing to move. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you guys have all learned from Nina's experience and ideas. And tune in for more Museum Next sessions in the afternoon.